So my name is Ze Soza, and I am the Central Ohio Regional Organizer for Equality Ohio. And I just started that position in December, brand new. And it's something that I've actually been wanting to do for a while. Before my work with Equality Ohio, I was working at the State House as a legislative aide for Senator Teresa Fetter, who represents the Toledo area. And before that, I was doing an internship actually that got my foot in the door of the State House. That's kind of how I got connected. It's what I started doing after I graduated with my bachelor's degree in 2018, I think. Yeah. So yeah, I ended up getting involved there, which was an interesting story. I did not necessarily plan to get involved in legislative, political work or like that world. I've always been a little bit more interested in advocacy and education. So I studied at Malone University, which is in Canton, Ohio, a private religious institution. An interesting experience as a gay male. I studied history and global international studies and really immersed myself in all of the things that I'm passionate about, which is, related to social issues. And for a long time thought that what I was going to get involved in the long term was either some type of academic education or directly involved in social activism in some capacity. So I'm really happy to be here now because it was, I'll get into the story a little bit more, but it was kind of a bit of a journey to actually get to where, okay, and now I'm spending, most of my hours in full-time work on actually like direct sort of community organizing and activism work, which I am absolutely loving ever since I started in December with Equality Ohio. So, so it's great. Yeah, a little bit about my work and my role. So it's, I really appreciate the sort of distinction that the organization makes between community organizing and activism, and that there's like overlap between what that means doing that type of work. And the way that I think of it in summary, really what that work is it's a practice in communication, right? Like I'm building relationships, making and holding relationships and talking to people essentially. It's really what I spend my time doing. I'm talking to people and in that capacity, identifying what the issues are, right? Identifying them and then also listening and learning what the issues are. Sort of that exchange, right? I see my role as being that sort of placeholder between, holding relationships and, kind of taking in information from outside of the community as well as putting out information. And in that vein, holding up that, we keep our organization accountable and that we, that we're just sort of effectively representing and communicating the type of society that we want to see reflected back, right? And the type of social change that we are looking for. So on the day-to-day work that manifests in all types of different work, we of course do a lot of activism for specific legislation that is queer positive or that protects or uplifts the LGBTQ community. So there's that legislative work, which we are involved in all levels of government, really, especially at the state level, but also local levels of government. We work with local governments to pass, for example, ordinances that protect LGBTQ people from discrimination, just as an example, right? So we might do a lot of that work. There's a lot of the community education work where we host events and we break down what is this legislation that's moving right through the legislature? What does it mean? What does it mean for queer people? We do a lot of that, right? And then, of course, we have the legal clinic side of the organization. And I have amazing, wonderful colleagues that are involved in that. That's more direct service work, right? With directly serving specific needs that LGBTQ clients have. So there's that mindset too, right? Sort of like community activism and education, but then also actually getting involved in directly serving the social needs of LGBTQ people. So that's great. It's exciting. I learn new things every day, which is the best kind of work in my opinion. That's always what I look for, is work and whatever I spend my time doing, that I always have the opportunity to learn and grow and become better, just on the individual level. So why am I passionate about doing this type of work? And why did I want to get involved with Equality Ohio for such a long time? That gets into some of my personal story and my personal history. I think a lot of us that get involved in this type of work, we usually have a personal stake in the matter. And yeah, we usually have the lived experience that has informed us that social change is needed. So for myself, okay, I'll get into a little bit of really like from the beginning, my background. So I am Ohio native. I was born in the state. I've lived in different parts of the state, originally like the Cleveland area, Lorain, Ohio for many years. I lived in Canton, Ohio for a while. That's where I went to college. And then I've only been in Columbus for the last 3 years now. So moved around a little bit, but I've always been in Ohio. I come from a culturally mixed family. My dad is a good old Midwestern white guy who actually does have Spanish roots. That's where the Soza name comes from. So European, Spanish roots, and then my mom is Puerto Rican, is Latina. So I have those Caribbean roots as well, and grew up in a culturally mixed household. Grew up in a very religious household. My dad is a pastor, and also a biblical scholar, actually, by trade. And so I grew up immersed in religious, in a religious household that more specifically was Pentecostal, good old Pentecostal, like Holy Spirit Christianity. And, with my mom's influence, there was a very sort of Caribbean flavor to that. And for much of my childhood, the church that my dad co-pastored and that I sort of grew up in the first part of my life was predominantly Puerto Rican and Black church with a sprinkling of white people. So that was like the flavor I grew up with heavy influence of religion, but specifically religious worship and expression that was very emotive, very much about how you worship with your body. And, I grew up with prophecies and the flags and all of that. And one of my earliest memories as a 4-year-old is almost dying, because I remember, I'll never forget, Sister Pam was taken by the Spirit, and my tiny little twink 4-year-old body happened to be standing behind Sister Pam, who was a fairly large woman, who, when you're taken by the Spirit, someone's supposed to catch you. And no one was there to catch Sister Pam. And poor little Joseph almost got completely, crushed to death. I remember my cousin running and pushing me out of the way. And as a 4-year-old, I'll never forget, this is when I knew, it was like, okay, we're Pentecostal. That's, that's what we are. Well, very, very early in my life and in my upbringing. And I had a very, very good upbringing, right? A very stable household. My dad was very educated. My mom and dad had a very stable, lovely marriage. And so in many ways, I grew up with the privilege of having a very kind of stable start in life and a solid foundation to be raised in, right? It was a very mixed and well-seasoned foundation, right? With a lot of different influence, where I grew up dually with, you know, Spanish speaking, you know, immigrant to a degree. Puerto Rico's part of the States, but the experience is still, you know, you come from the island and to the mainland, it's an immigrant experience. And I had my abuela, and I had, all of the cultural values growing up that are distinctive to a Caribbean sort of value system that emphasizes family, that emphasizes like community over individualism, you know. And I had that mixture along with my dad's influence, which was very, very, very white. And there was a very there was a very interesting dual dynamic that I grew up with, knowing that, wow, I come from two very, very, very different worlds that are very different from each other. And I grew up with that, and I grew up with, well, basically a lot of diversity in my life, right? I learned very quickly, though, that as much as I grew up in this very somewhat privileged, solid foundation with a lot of flavor and a lot of like, a lot of things that I really appreciate about where I come from, I learned very quickly that I was different. And noticed there is something very different about me, and didn't have the language for it in the early 90s, like, you know, what it is, but something was different. From both cultures, there were different forms of machismo. Right? There was sort of an overt colonized machismo that came from the Puerto Rican side, and then almost like kind of covert patriarchy that came from the white side that interacted interestingly, right? And I grew up I was always small, my stature and my physical body, I have a twink body, right? So like very, like I was physically small, and internally I felt small, right? I felt made to be small. I felt like my mannerisms were feminine. I was effeminate. And the more that I was growing up, that became more and more apparent. I didn't like sports. There's some of the like kind of almost like basics, you know what I mean, stereotypes of what it is to be like effeminate. But I just I didn't really naturally get along very well with my male counterparts. I had mostly female friends. My interests were just kind of eclectic, and and then when it came time for sexual maturation and puberty, I started to realize very quickly, like, oh, I am not oriented towards liking women very much, and realized very quickly that, oh my goodness, I am gay. And oh shit, basically, am I allowed to curse? You know, that's you know, had that moment very early on, right? Interestingly, there was some queer representation in my upbringing. I have some other family members that were queer, including my tia, my aunt on my Puerto Rican side, who is very, very visibly queer and out and proud, lesbian, sort of androgynous in the way that she presents. And I grew up very much having my tia Sonia as an influence and as representation, right? But there was always this understanding that, you know, with the religious kind of influence, that marriage is between a man and a woman and all that, right? Traditional, all that traditional stuff. I learned that I had other family members also that were queer, including 2 cousins that I grew up with very closely in the church. We grew up all as pastors' kids together. We're around the same age. And sure enough, it turned into, we grew up as like the 3 gay musketeers of our family. We're all very femme and very, you know, but privately, we're all closeted for all of our teenage years, and experienced the isolation that most queer people go through when coming to terms with themselves and understanding themselves. Definitely had that experience, and just had a real mixed bag experience of a lot of wonderful memories and experiences that are tied to my upbringing, that are tied to the church upbringing and the culturally mixed upbringing, but then also a lot of not so great memories. And just that the sort of overarching reality that, okay, I am second class in this world because of who I am. And who I am is not, it is not valued in this world. It is not included or thought of, or, you know, queerness, right, is an afterthought, if thought of at all, in the social environments that I am living in the social institutions that I have to navigate through. So just the lived experience, right, showed that. I think all of us as queer people go through, we have to come out to ourselves first, accept ourselves first. And that took a really long time for me. But when I finally did get there, and I was approaching my young adulthood by the time I got there, you know, I had a lot of anger and a lot of frustration that I was living with, and a lot of tension that I was living with, because yeah, the lived experience just continued to inform me that, okay, life is going to be a little bit more difficult. And my desires themselves, right, are, I mean, the lived experience was such that I felt even disconnected from really knowing what I even wanted out of life, right? And that's in every capacity. When I think about love, and when I think about all of the things that we know makes like a fulfilling and happy life, all of those things were put into question, right? What do I even want that to look like, right? As I understand myself as a queer person, like, what do I want out of career? What do I want? And these were all of the things that that were attention, and that, you know, in my young adulthood, I was kind of living with this frustration of, I feel like I have so much to figure out, and I don't have time to figure it all out, because I have to live life now, and I have to survive now, and I have to make decisions right now that are going to impact the rest of my life, like what I was doing in college, and what, like, you know. So yeah, living with all of those tensions, I finally came out. I was sort of outed, actually, when, you know, when I finally started dating. I did not start dating until about the age of 22, 21, 22. And did not start dating men until 23. So that was, when that happened, it didn't take very long for me to be outed, because, like, as soon as I started entertaining having men in my life, it just, that just happened, right? So I was pushed to that, right? Came out loud and proud, and this was also during the time I was in college. I was doing some activism work in college, actually, as a student leader. I was involved in a lot of like student-led organizations. That there was the Multicultural Student Union. There was I started a Latino student union during my time there, yeah, you know, at the same time that I was experiencing all of the forms of displacement that we experience as queer people, I felt that pressure when it came to race and culture as well. And, you know, I am visibly, I pass as white when I walk the streets, you know, so I have that privilege, but there was always this internal tension in my lived experience as well, by the fact that I had a cultural identity, I had an inheritance through, you know, my Puerto Rican lineage, that this country considers as brown, regardless of what you look like, right? Puerto Rican is a brown culture, which is this weird tension to live at when I'm not necessarily physically a brown person, but, you know, I am considered a brown person, or I'm considered a part of a brown community, right? The way that this country racializes is so weird. It doesn't make sense. And in many senses, I lived at that place of ambiguity, right? Like racial ambiguity and cultural ambiguity. I lived at that place, which is an experience in its own right. That also, like, you know, that lived experience really opened my eyes to the way in which race is such a it's kind of like the X factor, the X factor that this country uses to create hierarchy, and to to um, to instigate like positions of power and privilege. And so living at that weird tension of being afforded many privileges on account of my appearance and my start in life, and then also being afforded many underprivileges, and then also cost to that privilege. Like, I think one of the distinctions between a sort of white person that's also a person of color, like, you know, someone that can pass as white, and then a person that is not, that is just like a white person like my dad. One of the distinctions I think between our experience is that I will benefit from white privilege, but at a cost that my white counterparts don't have, right? And that cost is separation from family, separated, because I have many family members that do not pass as white, right? And so there's this disconnect of experience that we each have, and it really does this violence that I've always experienced, even within families where we really live different walks. We really go through different, totally different walks in this world. And so at the time of my young adulthood, I was really living with a lot of frustrations related to my intersectional identities, related to my very complex and layered lived experience that played out all of the really just bizarre and you know, the bizarre ways that this country upholds and creates hierarchies that are based on white supremacy and that are based on patriarchy. So having that lived experience, it just became absolutely clear to me, right, that this society as it's functioning now, it doesn't do it. It just is not it. And something's got to give and something's got to change. I have been, ever since I really arrived at that solid place where we're solidly without question, I'm like, okay, social change has to happen, but what does that mean? And what kind of social change? And how do we go about that? That's been a journey. That's been an ongoing journey since I kind of arrived to that place for certain to now. And it's still an ongoing journey. Within that journey, I've gone from that whole, maybe we can reform the systems that we have. Maybe we can, all the way to the extreme of like, ooh, no, the systems are, screwed up from the foundation, and we also need to do some work with actually using our imaginations and our innovative genius to create completely alternative systems and to kind of start anew with a society that from the ground up has queer people in mind, has Black people in mind, has immigrant and Latinx people in mind, right, from the ground up. And I've sort of arrived to that place. Like I said, it's just been a journey, and it continues to be an ongoing journey as I go through the lived experience of being a culturally mixed, racially ambiguous queer person who is like femme of center. I mean, all of those things, you know, have been really important in my lived experience, those factors of who I am. That going through that lived experience continues to color the way that I am observing the way that this world is, and the ways in which the systems and the powers that be don't work for us. So where I've arrived now, and where I'm sitting with now, by the time I've arrived at Equality Ohio, is, you know, I'm in a place where I understand, okay, social change has to happen. It has to happen everywhere. And one thing I appreciate about Equality Ohio is there is this acknowledgement through the lens of social movement ecology that we can and should be working to reform the systems that currently exist at the same time that we are making space for the imagination of new systems altogether. And then also there's a third camp that's really important about also working at the individual level, changing hearts and minds, which is that kind of one-to-one, one person at a time thing, which is really important as well. So having those three ways of thinking there's that framework exists in the organization and is very, very helpful. And I think really valuable. And I really value the idea and the value, the idea that all three of those methods can coexist, right? We don't have to like just choose one, like they can coexist, and we can maybe choose one that we're prioritizing, and I know there's other organizations that do that, like mad respect for Black and Pink as an organization that specifically does the work of abolition of our punitive justice systems that don't work, and doing a lot of that work of thinking up complete alternatives and like, let's abolish what we have and think of complete. And they exist mostly in that camp. And then there's other organizations that exist mostly in the camp of doing the individual one-on-one work. And I think Equality Ohio is where we're trying to have an even mix of both. A lot of our work, of course, is with the reforming systems. And I think the logic behind why we do take some time and do put some energy and resource into reforming systems that maybe in the long term and in the long game we want to like undo altogether, but that's like the long game, right? We understand that there are people who are living in states of emergency right now, and they need relief right now, like tomorrow or today, like need relief. And that's where the value of reforming current systems is that we can reduce some harm right now, and it's necessary to do that so that we are alive to be able to play the long game, right? So that we are alive and may be able to thrive a little bit too. Because we deserve to, if I never see in my lifetime, right, the like alternative systems created that actually include queer people from the ground up, if that's something I don't see in my lifetime, which it's unlikely. When I'm realistic, when I think in that place of realism, I think it's unlikely that I'll maybe see that in my lifetime. Maybe it's in a few lifetimes from now that work the fruits of that work will be felt. If that's the case, then I definitely value doing some work in the reforms area too, because let me experience some relief in my own lifetime, right? Let me experience a little bit of relief and a little bit of space to actually have some form of thriving and not just surviving. That's what I think the activism and organizing work always has to be inspired to that level, that we're not just doing this work to help queer people and other vulnerable communities survive systems and institutions that are out to kill us and out to displace us. We deserve more than survival. We deserve thriving. We deserve access to abundance and to more than just safety, but just like the actual space and resources to fully reach our potential, our creative potential, and doing all the things that make living a human life worthwhile, which is to create and explore and discover, I think, right? So, and that's something that, if I could take a moment to appreciate the queer community, that's something that I think is inherent to what it even means to be queer and LGBTQ. And this is where some of the influence of people like Adrienne Marie Brown, who I've been immersing myself in these readings, and other wonderful names like Audre Lorde and Octavia Butler, and who have a lot of writings that go the extra mile of actually like celebrating lives and communities and lived experiences that aren't usually celebrated, right? Like we usually, when we think about the queer experiences, we usually focus on the trauma and the struggle, even as, I brought it up when I tell what's my own lived experience. I like to stop and take a moment to also appreciate that actually being who I am, being a sort of ambiguous person living in two worlds culturally, person coming from mixed worlds, and someone who is queer, that has been the joy of my life. Like I would not trade it for the world, right? Like if I, if Genie, were to grant me, 3 wishes, making myself straight or making myself, I don't know, changing myself in any capacity would not be one of those wishes. I absolutely would not change the experience that I've had. And I went through a period of time where experimentally I asked other queer people, and especially other non-white queer people, that same question. Like, if you could like make yourself straight, make yourself cisgender, make yourself white, would you do that, right? To make your life easier? And consistently, the answer has been no. Of anyone that I asked that question, consistently, it's been no. Actually, as much as I've gone through shit, who I am and the perspective that I've gained out of life, the sort of the insight, the spiritual and social insight and growth, and who I've been able to become on account of some of my struggles, I value those things, right? This has been the answer from most people. And I really appreciate that. I think that queerness really is something to be celebrated. I think there are specific things historically that have defined the LGBTQ community. Like historically, as a community, we represent honesty, what it means to be just fundamentally honest about who we are, what it means to be fundamentally like authentic, and live in that authenticity in a world that discourages that, and that presents boxes. And even for like straight white people, right? There's a tremendous amount of pressure to sort of soften your true self and adjust and fit into boxes. From the very foundation, what it is to be LGBTQ is to reject that and to say, no, I'm going to be exactly who I am, even if you don't like it, even if you don't value it, and if it makes you uncomfortable. This is my truth. We choose authenticity. We choose love. And that is such a superpower, to do that. That is something that the rest of the world can learn from, right? And I think it actually maybe presents something that's really, really valuable and necessary for the rest of the world. That's kind of my hope, even, right? That for the rest of the world and those who are outside of our community, that actually, our presence and being here could be acknowledged as like a blessing to the rest of the world, and like, oh, I am if I'm a straight white person, I am enlivened and enriched by having relationships with or interactions with, or just the presence of queer people and non-white people in my life, right? And that's, as much as we, a lot of times in activism work, we approach it with, we need this change because we're coming from that state of emergency. We have to protect our community. We have to, and yes, to all of that. But it's like, also, let's also implement this change actually for the betterment of the whole world, and for the fact that the whole world has something tremendous to gain by full inclusion of all people, by actually valuing and actually, just valuing and nourishing the existence of the diversity that is natural to humanity, which includes, queer people, and it includes the racial and cultural diversity that we all exhibit. I like to sometimes this work can get really heavy, and then as an organizer, right, I'm always hearing stories. I'm hearing a lot of people's stories constantly, whether it's I'm gathering testimony on a bill we're working on, whether whether it's just, I mean, people just tell me their stories. Like it just happens when I'm on the ground, like kind of interacting. And sometimes the stories are extraordinarily traumatic, you know? I think even this is a conversation we have internally within the organization often, the need to protect ourselves and to implement self-care into our routine, because since many of us have personal stakes, by hearing these stories, we experience secondhand trauma a lot. And I know that's something that I've had to become more and more aware now that I'm in this role. There was a day a few weeks ago, actually, where I think I just wasn't appreciating how heavy it was starting to get, like some of the interactions and the stories. And I was just carrying it and going about my day. And then it was like some stupid little camel or hair that broke the camel's back, like kind of hit me. And I like felt this like overwhelming, like I had a breakdown emotionally, because it was just so much to be carrying these things, and there's so much heaviness that goes into this work, and because that goes with the territory. So that's why I like to bring up that sort of more positive approach that we can take. It's still an approach that motivates this work very with urgency. It motivates with urgency, but it's like, instead of always focusing on, we need social change because we're dying, or we need social change because we're in a state of emergency, instead also balancing that with the approach of, we need social change because of what the world could be, because of the thriving and the abundance and just the wellness that we actually can achieve, not just for queer people, but for everyone. And that includes any person that's ever rejected me in my life, any person that has that might to this day, right? All those unnamed people that ever toss the word faggot my way, right? That ever, like, all of that, like I include them too. And this is why I appreciate a lot of the conversation that's been had more and more recently with transformative justice and restorative justice. I really, really appreciate those approaches to social change, that those have been concepts that have become a regular part of the conversations we have at Equality Ohio. Yeah, I think that in this work, that's what we're going for, right? We're really, really trying to think big and really acknowledging the fact that we have every capacity to build the type of world that we want to be living in. And that is a world that genuinely nourishes all people, and that genuinely supports and uplifts the thriving of all people in all of their diversity.
Happy Pride, everyone. I'm Gio Santiago. I use he, him, his pronouns from Equality Ohio. For Pride Month, we're celebrating by uploading a new video to YouTube every weekday for the entire month. If you'd like to support Equality Ohio, you can like and subscribe, or to support us directly, donate at equalityohio.org and share this video. Thank you and happy Pride.